Dealing with abandoned property, a whole different subject. I talked about previously about not moving out of the property. What if you have moved out of the property? Well, the lender may have gotten forced place insurance, which of course isn't protecting you. You're still liable. If a foreclosure has been filed, once the foreclosure has been filed, the lender is responsible to maintain the property. If there are property, let's assume that there's property code violations, the lawn isn't being cut, the municipality normally will issue a citation. Once they know the property is abandoned, and the lender is supposed to tell them, then the lender has to pay for those costs, not the homeowner. I always tell people in this situation it's still a good idea to pay attention to the property, watch it, because again, you have potential liability for that property if you've moved out. Sometimes we have situations where people have not moved out, but the lender will try to lock them out anyway. That's a big mistake. They don't have that right, and you have to fight that, and typically fight that in writing. Mortgage rescue scams, another subject. We've seen we saw these a lot of times earlier in the decade when property, what happens is somebody goes to a desperate homeowner who happens to have a house facing foreclosure, and it happens to have some equity, and they go to them and say, look, why don't you sell the property to me, and I'll sell it back to you for an agreed upon price at some point in the future. And what then happens is that they don't really pay the mortgage. Essentially, they pocket the money. There's all kinds of variations of these, but it's a scam that preys on desperate people. I always tell people that they should know what their property's worth, and they should avoid any kind of offer that looks like it's too good to be true. Tax sales. This happens a lot. Of people will come to me and say, well, I've got this notice that the town, the municipality is doing a tax sale. They're selling my house. No, they're not. What they're doing is they're selling a certificate. They're owed taxes, so they'll hold an auction. And the owner at that auction doesn't buy the property, they buy a tax sale certificate. That gives them the right to pay the taxes. It's a rather curious auction because what happens is they start at 18% and they bid down the interest rate to 0. And if they want to, they'll actually pay a premium beyond that, and somebody gets the tax sale certificate. That gives them the right to, again, foreclose after 2 years. If they do foreclose after the 2-year period and there's a foreclosure judgment, they now own the property. This typically won't happen because taxes are first lien ahead of mortgages, and the mortgage holder will typically pay the taxes rather than let that happen. That's everything. Any questions? I've covered as much as I could here. Any questions for me? Any things I haven't covered? Anything you want to go over? Yeah.
One question I had. At the tax sale, or rather at the sheriff's sale, the lender actually may be bidding on the property? They don't have a...
What will typically happen, as I understand it, is the lender will bid a minimum price for the property. Okay. And most times they're the only one there. So they buy the property and they get it for $100. Does that mean that if they sue you for a deficiency that they can sue you for all but $100? No, they have to give you a credit for the market value of the property. The lender is looking to get money for the property or to get the property back so that they can sell it. And typically at that point they'll hire a realtor and the realtor will list the property for sale. But yeah, they do bid. They will bid. And if somebody comes in and says, well, I'll bid $200, the lender's not going to put up with that. We're going to say, well, we're owed $150,000. That's our bid. But that's pretty rare. Usually, unless a property actually has equity in it, most times people aren't going to bid at a sheriff's sale. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Again, there's a lot here, but a lot of it, the devil's in the details, and it requires essentially a knowledge of what's going on and avoid a lot of the misconceptions. Anybody else have any questions?
Yeah, I have one.
Sure.
Have you ever seen a bankruptcy situation where student loans were dischargeable?
It's very hard to discharge student loans. Many years ago, there was a decision called Bruner, which said essentially that, and it's still the law that's applied. Let's put it this way: if you want to discharge a student loan, you have to have made a good faith effort to pay the student loan. You have to have no ability to pay the loan in the future. Essentially, you have to be, I suppose if you're on life support or you're a vegetable and you're never going to earn anything, you might be able to show substantial hardship. It's very hard to prove. Student loans are one of the biggest problems facing our society today. The numbers of outstanding student loans are huge. And because of the way the laws changed, as it presently stands, they can't be discharged. I tell most people that very often the best way to do a discharge, if you happen to have a federal student loan, there are various programs through the lending process, the federal government, ways in which you can discharge student loans after a period of time. You can enter into income-based repayment, and that's usually the best thing to do. We have used Chapter 13 essentially to force. I've had people that had student loans and they were being hounded for student loans they couldn't begin to pay. We put them into a Chapter 13 to basically give them 5 years to pay what they could afford and see what happens then. But student loans are very hard to discharge. Not all student loans are non-dischargeable, but again, it's been pretty broad now. It has to be a student loan that was either done under a federal program or it has certain tax qualifications. If you've got a student loan situation like that, I tell people the first thing they have to do is find out as much as they can about what the terms of the student loan was. Most people don't have the loan documents, but that is a major problem.
Are you able to negotiate with the guarantor? I mean, to work out a reduction either in the interest or principal?
I haven't had any experience with that. Typically with student loans, if a student loan creditor is owed money, all they can do is sue and try to collect. You may not be able to discharge the debt, but like they say, you can't get blood from a stone. So you may eventually be able to work out some kind of payment term after they've gotten a judgment, and that's probably what you would end up doing. Other than that, there are programs, and they're part of the federal programs, the different loan programs, to allow you to make income-based repayment. I know there are programs for people in certain professions that can, public service professions, that they can get a discharge or forgiveness of loan because of that. But it's very hard to get student loans discharged with a bankruptcy. Okay. All right. Thank you. Sure. All right.